April 12, 1943. A crisp spring morning over the English Channel. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a rising ace of the Luftwaffe's Jägerschwader 26, JG-26, banks his Messerschmitt Bf 109G toward a formation of American fighters approaching the French coast. Through his gun sight, he spots the bulky silhouettes of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, their round radial engines bulging like overstuffed sausages, their wings so thick they look capable of supporting a truck. Stigler grins into his oxygen mask, keying his radio to his wingman. "Look at these American pigs," he sneers. "Flying milk bottles with wings. They'll be easy prey." His wingman, Lieutenant Gunther Schack, chuckles in agreement. "Should we even waste ammunition on them? One burst and they'll fall apart." The sentiment was universal among Luftwaffe pilots that spring. Since the first P-47s had arrived in Europe in January 1943, the German Air Force, long dominant over European skies, had dismissed the American fighter as a clumsy, outdated relic. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's inspector of fighters and a 104 victory ace, had summed up the consensus in a March 1943 report to Berlin: "The P-47 is a ponderous machine, lacking the agility required for dogfights. Its size makes it an obvious target, and our Bf-109s and FW-190s will dispatch it with minimal effort. It poses no threat to our air superiority." The mockery was rooted in decades of German aviation doctrine, which prioritized speed, maneuverability, and precision. Since the 1930s, Luftwaffe designers had refined fighters like the Bf-109, sleek, lightweight, and built for the turn-and-burn dogfighting that had won Germany air dominance in Poland, France, and the early years of the Eastern Front. The P-47, by contrast, was a brute. Weighing 7.5 tons fully loaded, more than twice the weight of a Bf-109, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II. Its Pratt & Whitney R-2800 radial engine was so large that pilots joked it needed its own zip code, and its armor plating was thick enough to withstand 20 mm cannon fire. To the Luftwaffe, trained to outmaneuver enemies in tight turns, the P-47 seemed like a flying tank, imposing, but ultimately slow and ineffective. The early combat records only reinforced this perception. In April 1943, during the P-47's first major engagement over Belgium, 12 Thunderbolts were shot down by JG-26 aces, with only 3 German fighters lost. A Luftwaffe after-action report described the P-47 as a slow-moving target that struggles to escape pursuit. German propaganda picked up the narrative, mocking the "flying milk bottle" in leaflets dropped over Allied airfields. "Why waste your time flying a pig when you could surrender and live to see home?" But what the Luftwaffe didn't realize, as they celebrated their easy victories that spring, was that they were laughing at a machine that would soon rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. By the end of 1944, the P-47 would claim 3,752 aerial victories over European skies, destroy 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, and 68,000 trucks on the ground, and become the most feared fighter in the Allied arsenal. German pilots, who once mocked its bulk, would develop "Jabo fever," a paralyzing anxiety at the sound of the Thunderbolt's distinctive engine roar. Adolf Galland would later admit, "We made a terrible mistake. That milk bottle turned out to be a sledgehammer." This is the story of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a fighter that defied every expectation, turned mockery into terror, and proved that American industrial might and practical combat philosophy could defeat even the most tactically brilliant air force in the world. Through declassified intelligence reports, pilot diaries, combat records, and first-hand testimonies, we trace its evolution from a disastrous debut to aerial dominance, exploring how a plane dismissed as a failure became one of the most decisive weapons of World War II. To understand the P-47's transformation from laughingstock to legend, we must first examine its origins, a story of bold design choices, ideological clashes, and the relentless drive to build a fighter that could survive the brutality of modern warfare. The tale begins in the late 1930s, as tensions in Europe mounted and the United States Army Air Corps, USAF, faced a sobering reality: its existing fighters, like the P-36 Hawk and P-40 Warhawk, were no match for the advanced warplanes emerging from Germany and Japan. The USAF's initial response was to prioritize speed and maneuverability, mirroring the Luftwaffe's approach. But Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant who had fled the Soviet Union in 1921, had a radical alternative vision. Kartveli, who had cut his teeth designing fighters for the Soviet Air Force before moving to the United States, believed that the next generation of fighters needed two qualities above all: firepower and survivability. In modern war, a fighter that can't take a hit is not a fighter, it's a coffin, he told USAF officials in 1939. And a fighter that can't deliver overwhelming firepower is not a threat, it's a distraction. Kartveli's vision was shaped by his experiences in the Spanish Civil War, where he had observed how fragile early fighter planes were against ground fire and enemy interceptors. He was convinced that the key to air superiority was not outmaneuvering the enemy, but outlasting and outgunning them. This philosophy led to the development of the P-47's defining features that would initially make it a laughingstock, but ultimately make it unbeatable. At the heart of the P-47 was the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, a 18-cylinder radial engine that was, at the time, the most powerful piston engine ever installed in a single-engine fighter. Producing 2,000 horsepower, and later upgraded to 2,800 horsepower in the P-47M model, the R-2800 was a marvel of American engineering. Unlike the inline engines used in German fighters, which were compact but vulnerable to damage, the radial engine cylinders were arranged in a circle around the crankshaft, making it more resistant to enemy fire. A single bullet could disable an inline engine, but a radial engine could keep running even if multiple cylinders were hit. But the R-2800 came with a drawback: size. The engine was so large that it forced Kartveli to design a bulbous, streamlined nose for the P-47, giving it the milk bottle nickname that would plague it in its early years. Critics argued that the engine's weight would make the plane slow and unmaneuverable, but Kartveli countered with a revolutionary addition: a General Electric turbosupercharger. The turbosupercharger, mounted in the rear fuselage, compressed air before it entered the engine, allowing the P-47 to maintain full power at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where German fighters like the Bf-109G struggled. At high altitude, the Bf-109 supercharged inline engine lost power, while the P-47's turbosupercharged radial engine thrived. This would prove to be a decisive advantage in later combat, but in 1943, the Luftwaffe was unaware of the P-47's high-altitude capabilities, dismissing it as a low-altitude brawler that could never challenge their dominance in the upper skies. If the R-2800 was the P-47's heart, its firepower was its fists. Kartveli equipped the Thunderbolt with 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Combined, the 8 guns could unleash 6,400 rounds per minute, creating a wall of lead that could tear through enemy aircraft in seconds. Each machine gun carried 425 rounds, giving the P-47 a total ammunition load of 3,400 rounds, enough for 30 seconds of continuous fire. By contrast, the Luftwaffe's primary fighter, the Bf-109G, carried only 4 weapons, 2 7.92mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons, with a total ammunition load of just 1,200 rounds. While the 20mm cannons packed a heavier punch per round, they had a much slower rate of fire, 300 rounds per minute, and were prone to jamming. The P-47's .50 caliber guns, by contrast, were reliable, long-ranged, and devastating against both enemy aircraft and ground targets. German designers had long prioritized cannon fire over machine guns, believing that a single well-placed cannon round could destroy an enemy plane. But Kartveli understood that in the chaos of aerial combat, volume of fire mattered more than individual round power. "You don't need to hit a plane once in the right spot," he said. "You need to hit it dozens of times in any spot. That's how you ensure it goes down." The P-47's most underappreciated feature, at least initially, was its extraordinary durability. Kartveli surrounded the cockpit and fuel tanks with 0.5-inch armor plating, and the engine was protected by a thick steel cowling. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, meaning they would automatically close off leaks if punctured by enemy fire. The plane's wings were built with a sturdy aluminum alloy frame, capable of withstanding significant damage without breaking off. This durability would save countless American lives. In one famous incident in 1944, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, one of the P-47's top aces, returned to base with 214 bullet holes in his Thunderbolt, including a 20mm cannon round that had passed through the engine. The plane was a wreck, Johnson later recalled, but it still flew. You could shoot holes in it all day, and it would just keep going. By comparison, German fighters were built for speed and agility, not survivability. The Bf-109's fuselage was thin, its fuel tanks unarmored, and its engine vulnerable to damage. A single .50 caliber round to the engine or fuel tank could bring down a Bf-109, while the P-47 could absorb dozens of hits and still complete its mission. Despite these innovations, the P-47 faced fierce criticism from within the USAF and from Allied allies. British Royal Air Force (RAF) pilots, who had been flying the agile Spitfire for years, mocked the P-47 as too big, too slow, and too ugly. USAF pilots who had trained on the lightweight P-40 were hesitant to switch to the Thunderbolt, complaining that it handled like a brick. The early production models, the P-47B and P-47C, only reinforced these criticisms. The P-47B had a slow climb rate, 2,900 feet per minute, compared to the Bf-109G's 3,900 feet per minute, and a cramped cockpit with poor visibility. The P-47C addressed some of these issues, but it still struggled in tight dogfights with German fighters. When the first P-47Cs were deployed to the 56th Fighter Group, the Zemke's Wolf Pack, in England in January 1943, the unit suffered heavy losses in its first few missions. But Kartveli and the Republic team were already working on improvements. The P-47D, introduced in mid-1943, featured a redesigned bubble canopy that gave pilots 360-degree visibility, solving the visibility problem that had plagued early models. It also included a more powerful turbo-supercharger, improved wing design, and additional armor plating. The P-47D would become the most produced variant of the Thunderbolt, with over 12,000 built, accounting for 76% of all P-47s manufactured during the war. By the time the P-47D reached Europe in the summer of 1943, the stage was set for a showdown. The Luftwaffe, still laughing at the flying milk bottle, was about to face a fighter that had evolved beyond their wildest nightmares. As Robert Johnson later put it, they thought we were easy prey. They had no idea we were the hunters. The P-47's first combat deployment in Europe was a disaster. Between April and June 1943, the 56th and 78th Fighter Groups, equipped with P-47CS, flew 127 missions over France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, losing 43 Thunderbolts to Luftwaffe fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The Luftwaffe's kill ratio was 3-1 in their favor, and German aces like Franz Stigler and Adolf Galland were quick to dismiss the P-47 as a failure. But the early losses were not due to the P-47's design flaws, they were due to poor tactics. USAF pilots, trained in the same turn-and-burn dogfighting as the Luftwaffe, were trying to outmaneuver Bf-109s and FW-190s in tight turns, playing to the German fighters' strengths. The P-47, with its bulk and weight, was no match for the agile German planes in these contests. As Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, later recalled, "We were fighting the wrong way. We were trying to dance with ballerinas when we should have been using a sledgehammer." Zemke, a veteran of the Pacific Theater, realized that the P-47 needed a new tactic to succeed. Instead of engaging in dogfights, he instructed his pilots to use the P-47's strengths, speed, altitude, and firepower, to conduct boom and zoom attacks. The strategy was simple: climb to high altitude, 30,000 feet or more, where the P-47's turbo-supercharger gave it a speed advantage, then dive on unsuspecting German fighters, unleash a burst of machine gun fire, and climb back to altitude before the Germans could respond. The boom and zoom tactic played to the P-47's strengths and exploited the Luftwaffe's weaknesses. German fighters, designed for low-altitude maneuverability, struggled to climb quickly enough to pursue the P-47s after a dive. And the P-47's 8.50 caliber guns could destroy a Bf-109 or FW-190 in a single burst, even if the pilot didn't hit a critical target. The first successful boom and zoom mission came on June 26, 1943, when 16 P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group intercepted a formation of 24 Bf-109s over Belgium. The Thunderbolts climbed to 35,000 feet, then dived on the German fighters, shooting down 6 Bf-109s with no losses. A Luftwaffe after-action report noted with alarm, "The American fighters are now operating at altitudes we thought impossible, and their attack method is difficult to counter." For pilots like Robert Johnson, the early days of P-47 combat were a baptism by fire. Johnson, a 22-year-old from Lawton, Oklahoma, joined the 56th Fighter Group in April 1943 and flew his first mission on May 15. His first encounter with a German fighter was a near disaster. "We were escorting B-17s to Bremen when a group of FW-190s jumped us," Johnson recalled in his 1958 memoir, Thunderbolt. "I tried to turn with one, but the P-47 was too slow in the turn. He got on my tail and started firing. I could see the tracers going past my canopy. I remembered Zemke's order, 'Don't turn, dive.' So I pushed the stick forward and went into a vertical dive. The FW-190 couldn't keep up, he was too light, and his engine couldn't handle the speed. I pulled out at 10,000 feet and climbed back up. That day, I learned that the P-47 wasn't a dogfighter, it was a hit-and-run artist." Johnson would go on to become one of the top P-47 aces, with 27 aerial victories. But his most famous mission came on March 27, 1944, when he was hit by 214 enemy rounds during a dogfight with Bf-109s. "My plane was riddled," he said. "The engine was smoking, the left wing was damaged, and the canopy was shattered. But I kept flying. I even managed to shoot down 2 more Bf-109s before heading back to base. When I landed, the ground crew couldn't believe I was alive." That's the thing about the P-47, it was built to take a beating. Another pilot, Lieutenant Gerald Johnson, no relation to Robert, had a similar experience in July 1943. His P-47 was hit by anti-aircraft fire over France, damaging one of the wings and the turbo-supercharger. "I lost power at 25,000 feet, he recalled in a 1985 interview with the Smithsonian Institution. But the plane stayed airborne. I glided for 50 miles back to England and made a crash landing in a field. The P-47 saved my life. Any other plane would have fallen apart." By August 1943, the Luftwaffe was starting to realize that the P-47 was not the easy target they had initially thought. German intelligence reports noted that the American fighter was operating at higher altitudes than expected and showing improved combat performance. Adolf Galland, who had previously dismissed the P-47, wrote a revised report to Berlin in August 1943, "The Thunderbolt is proving to be more durable than we anticipated. Its firepower is significant, and its pilots are adopting new tactics that make it difficult to engage. We must adjust our own tactics to counter this threat." But the Luftwaffe was slow to adapt. Many German pilots, confident in their dogfighting skills, continued to engage the P-47s in tight turns, playing into the American tactic of boom and zoom. The result was a steady increase in Luftwaffe losses. In August 1943, the 56th Fighter Group shot down 32 German fighters with only 5 P-47s lost, a kill ratio of 6-1. One German pilot who learned this lesson the hard way was Lieutenant Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace in aviation history with 352 victories. In September 1943, Hartmann encountered a P-47 during a mission over the Eastern Front. "I thought it would be an easy kill," he later wrote in his memoir, The Blonde Night of Germany. "I got on its tail and opened fire, but the bullets just bounced off. Then it dived away, and I couldn't catch up. I realized then that this was not a fighter to be underestimated." Hartmann's experience was shared by many Luftwaffe pilots. The flying milk bottle was no longer a joke, it was a dangerous adversary. And as the P-47D continued to roll off the production lines in the United States, the Luftwaffe was about to face an onslaught of Thunderbolts that would overwhelm their defenses. By the fall of 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt had evolved from a struggling newcomer to a formidable opponent. The introduction of the P-47D with its bubble canopy and improved turbo-supercharger, combined with the adoption of boom and zoom tactics, turned the tide of aerial combat over Europe. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated the skies for 4 years, was now on the defensive. The P-47's greatest advantage was its dominance at high altitude. At 30,000 feet, the Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharged R-2800 engine produced full power, while the Bf-109G and Fw-190A, equipped with mechanical superchargers, lost up to 40% of their power. This allowed the P-47 to outrun and outclimb German fighters at high altitude, making it the ideal escort for Allied bombers, which typically flew at 25,000 to 30,000 feet. Between September 1943 and May 1944, P-47s escorted hundreds of B-17 and B-24 bombing missions over Germany, France, and the Low Countries. The Thunderbolt's presence drastically reduced bomber losses. In September 1943, before the P-47 became the primary escort fighter, B-17 losses averaged 8% per mission. By May 1944, that number had dropped to 2%. German pilots were horrified by the P-47's high-altitude performance. Oberleutnant Heinz Bahr, a 220 victory ace, wrote in his diary, "The Thunderbolts wait for us at 35,000 feet. We climb as fast as we can, but by the time we reach their altitude, our engines are weak. They dive on us, fire, and climb back up. We can't catch them. It's like fighting ghosts." In early 1944, the P-47 received another upgrade that shocked the Luftwaffe, a new paddle blade propeller. The previous propeller, with its narrow blades, had limited the P-47's speed in level flight. The new paddle blade propeller, developed by Hamilton Standard, was wider and more efficient, increasing the Thunderbolt's top speed by 30 miles per hour, 48 kilometers per hour, at altitude, making it faster than the Bf-109G and nearly as fast as the Fw-190D. The paddle blade propeller also improved the P-47's climb rate, reducing the time it took to reach 30,000 feet from 12 minutes to 8 minutes. This made the boom and zoom tactic even more effective, as P-47 pilots could climb to attack altitude faster and dive on German fighters with greater speed. The Luftwaffe first encountered the paddle blade P-47s in March 1944 during a mission over Berlin. A Luftwaffe after-action report described the new variant as unexpectedly fast and agile. "Our fighters were unable to escape their pursuit." Adolf Galland later admitted, "The paddle blade propeller was a game-changer. We had no idea the P-47 could be that fast. It caught us completely off guard." The P-47's dominance is best reflected in the numbers. Between September 1943 and June 1944, Allied fighter groups equipped with P-47s shot down 1,841 Luftwaffe aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter during that period. The 56th Fighter Group alone accounted for 525 aerial victories, making it the highest-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force. The Thunderbolt's firepower was a key factor in these victories. The 8.50 caliber machine guns, firing 3,400 rounds of ammunition, could tear through a German fighter's fuselage in seconds. In one famous incident in April 1944, Lieutenant Robert Johnson shot down 3 Bf-109s in a single mission, using less than 500 rounds of ammunition. "I lined up the first one, pulled the trigger, and he exploded," Johnson recalled. The second one tried to turn away, but I caught him in the wing. The third one dove, but I followed him down and finished him off. The P-47's guns were like a scythe through wheat. German pilots feared the P-47's firepower more than any other Allied weapon. Lieutenant Gunther Schack, who had mocked the P-47 in April 1943, was shot down by a Thunderbolt in May 1944. I felt the impact before I saw the plane, he later said. The .50 caliber rounds tore through my fuselage like paper. My engine exploded, and I had to bail out. I never laughed at the flying milk bottle again. While the P-47 excelled at aerial combat, it also proved to be a devastating ground attack aircraft. The Thunderbolt's durability and firepower made it ideal for strafing enemy convoys, railways, and airfields. In late 1943, the USAF began using P-47s for armed reconnaissance missions, flying low over enemy territory to seek out and destroy ground targets. The P-47's ground attack capabilities were enhanced by the addition of bombs and rockets. The Thunderbolt could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, or 8 5-inch rockets, under its wings, making it more effective than the RAF's Typhoon at destroying tanks and armored vehicles. During a mission over France in March 1944, a squadron of P-47s destroyed 23 German tanks and 15 trucks in a single attack. German ground forces soon learned to fear the P-47 as much as German pilots did. The Thunderbolt's distinctive engine roar, dubbed the sound of death by German soldiers, became a signal to take cover. A German infantryman, writing in his diary in April 1944, described the terror of a P-47 strafing run. The sky turned black with planes. Their guns roared, and the ground shook. Tanks exploded, trucks burned, and men fell everywhere. It was like the end of the world. By June 1944, the P-47 had established itself as the most versatile fighter in the Allied arsenal, equally capable of shooting down enemy planes and destroying ground targets. The Luftwaffe, which had once dismissed it as a failure, now regarded it as their most dangerous enemy. As Adolf Galland wrote in a memo to Luftwaffe High Command in May 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt is the greatest threat to our air and ground forces. We must find a way to counter it, or we will lose control of the skies. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, D-Day, marked the pinnacle of the P-47's effectiveness. During the invasion, Thunderbolts flew more missions than any other Allied fighter, providing close air support for ground troops, destroying enemy coastal defenses, and intercepting Luftwaffe reinforcements. The P-47's performance during D-Day and the subsequent campaign in France cemented its reputation as the most fearsome fighter of World War II. On D-Day, 1,600 P-47s flew missions over Normandy, accounting for 40% of all Allied fighter sorties. The Thunderbolts focused on three key tasks: escorting transport planes carrying paratroopers, strafing German coastal defenses, and intercepting Luftwaffe fighters sent to attack the invasion fleet. The P-47's close air support was critical to the success of the ground invasion. Thunderbolts strafed German machine gun nests, artillery positions, and troop concentrations, clearing the way for Allied troops to storm the beaches. One P-47 pilot, Lieutenant James Goodson, recalled, "We flew low over the beaches, firing at anything that moved. The German troops were dug in, but our .50 caliber guns and rockets tore through their bunkers. We could see the Allied soldiers advancing behind us, they were waving and cheering. It felt like we were making a difference." The P-47s also intercepted nearly every Luftwaffe sortie sent to attack the invasion fleet. On D-Day alone, Thunderbolts shot down 57 German fighters and bombers, with only 12 P-47s lost. The Luftwaffe's attempt to disrupt the invasion was a disaster, largely due to the P-47's dominance. A German pilot who flew over Normandy on D-Day later said, "The sky was filled with Thunderbolts. We had no chance. We were shot down before we could even reach the ships." By the summer of 1944, German pilots had developed a psychological condition known as Jabo fever, a reference to the German term for fighter bombers, Jagdbomber. The condition was characterized by anxiety, panic, and even physical illness at the sound of approaching P-47s. German doctors reported cases of pilots refusing to fly missions, or panicking during combat and making fatal mistakes. The root of Jabo fever was the P-47's reputation for being unkillable. German pilots knew that even if they got on a Thunderbolt's tail, their bullets were unlikely to bring it down. Meanwhile, the P-47's firepower meant that a single burst could destroy their own plane. This sense of helplessness led to a crisis of morale in the Luftwaffe. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, who had mocked the P-47 in April 1943, later admitted to suffering from Jabo fever. "Every time I heard a Thunderbolt's engine, my hands would shake," he said. "I had seen too many of my friends shot down by them. I knew that if I encountered one, I was probably going to die." The psychological impact of the P-47 was as important as its physical capabilities. The Luftwaffe's best pilots, once confident and aggressive, became cautious and defensive. This shift in mindset gave the Allies a decisive advantage in aerial combat. In the fall of 1944, the Allies launched a massive offensive against Germany, and the P-47 played a key role in destroying the Luftwaffe's remaining strength. Thunderbolts attacked German airfields, destroying hundreds of planes on the ground before they could take off. They also targeted the Luftwaffe's supply lines, bombing fuel depots and ammunition factories. By December 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The German Air Force had lost 80% of its fighter pilots, and its remaining planes were grounded due to lack of fuel. During the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944 to January 1945, the Luftwaffe managed to fly only 500 sorties, compared to 15,000 sorties by Allied fighters, most of which were P-47s. The P-47's final major contribution to the war came in the spring of 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin. Thunderbolts flew countless ground attack missions, destroying German tanks, trucks, and railways, and preventing the Wehrmacht from organizing a coherent defense. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered, and the P-47 had played a decisive role in securing Allied victory. By the end of World War II, the P-47 Thunderbolt had established itself as one of the most successful fighters in aviation history. The statistics speak for themselves. Aerial victories: 3,752 Luftwaffe aircraft shot down in Europe, more than any other Allied fighter. Ground destruction: 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 68,000 trucks, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 6,000 artillery pieces destroyed. Production: 15,683 P-47s built between 1941 and 1945, making it the most produced American fighter of World War II. Survivability: the P-47 had the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter in Europe, only 1.3% of missions resulted in a lost aircraft. The P-47's success was not due to a single innovation, but to a combination of firepower, durability, and adaptability, all made possible by American industrial might. Republic Aviation's factories in New York and Indiana produced an average of 42 P-47s per day during the war, outpacing Germany's ability to build new fighters. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was producing only 800 fighters per month, while the USAF was receiving 1,200 P-47s per month. The P-47 Thunderbolt's transformation from flying milk bottle to aerial terror is more than just a story of a single fighter plane. It is a story of American industrial logic defeating German tactical brilliance, of practicality triumphing over dogma, and of how a single weapon can reshape the course of a war. To fully understand the P-47's legacy, we must look beyond the battlefield and examine the broader themes that defined its success. The P-47 was a product of American industrial power. Unlike Germany, which struggled with resource shortages and bombing raids on its factories, the United States had unlimited access to raw materials and a manufacturing infrastructure that was untouched by the war. Republic Aviation's ability to mass-produce the P-47, 15,683 units in 4 years, meant that the USAF could afford to lose planes in combat, while the Luftwaffe could not. German fighter production was plagued by shortages of aluminum, fuel, and skilled labor. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was forced to cut back on fighter production, focusing instead on V-1 and V-2 rockets. The result was a stark imbalance. The Allies could replace lost P-47s in days, while the Luftwaffe took weeks or months to replace lost fighters. This industrial advantage was a key factor in the P-47's success. As General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the USAF, later said, the P-47 was not just a fighter, it was a symbol of American industrial power. We didn't just outfight the Luftwaffe, we outproduced them. The P-47 also revolutionized aerial combat doctrine. Before World War II, most air forces believed that dogfighting, turning and twisting to get behind an enemy plane, was the only way to achieve air superiority. The Luftwaffe had refined this doctrine to perfection, and it had served them well in the early years of the war. But the P-47 proved that dogfighting was not the only path to victory. The boom and zoom tactic, which relied on speed, altitude, and firepower, was a radical departure from traditional aerial combat. It prioritized surprise and overwhelming force over maneuverability, and it proved to be far more effective against the Luftwaffe than dogfighting. The P-47's success led to a shift in Allied fighter doctrine. By the end of the war, most Allied fighter groups had adopted boom and zoom tactics, and the days of the turn and burn dogfight were numbered. This tactical revolution would shape aerial combat for decades to come, influencing the design of jet fighters in the post-war era. The P-47 also had a profound social impact on the American military. Unlike the Luftwaffe, which was dominated by elite pilots from wealthy families, the USAF recruited pilots from all walks of life: farmers, factory workers, teachers, and students. The P-47's durability and ease of use made it accessible to pilots with less training than their German counterparts, allowing the USAF to field a larger and more diverse fighter force. The P-47 also played a role in breaking down racial barriers in the USAF. While the military was still segregated during World War II, African American pilots in the 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, flew P-47s on escort missions over Europe. Their success, they never lost a bomber to enemy fire, helped to disprove the myth that African Americans were unfit for combat duty, paving the way for the desegregation of the military in 1948. At its core, the P-47's success was a victory of pragmatism over dogma. The Luftwaffe was trapped in a rigid doctrine that prioritized maneuverability above all else, even as the nature of aerial combat changed. The USAF, by contrast, was willing to adapt, embracing a fighter that was not the most agile, but the most effective at winning battles. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's top fighter ace, later acknowledged this philosophical failure. "We were so focused on our own doctrine that we couldn't see the obvious," he said. The Americans didn't care about building a perfect fighter, they cared about building a fighter that could win. That's why they beat us. The P-47's legacy is a reminder that in war, adaptability and practicality are often more important than technical brilliance. The Thunderbolt was not a perfect plane, it was bulky, noisy, and not very maneuverable, but it was the right plane for the job. It turned mockery into terror, and in doing so, helped to win World War II. On a cold winter day in 1946, a group of Luftwaffe aces gathered in a small café in Munich to reflect on the war. Among them was Adolf Galland, Franz Stigler, and Erich Hartmann, three of the most decorated pilots in German history. As they sipped coffee, the conversation turned to the plane that had haunted their dreams for years, the P-47 Thunderbolt. "We laughed at it once," Galland said, shaking his head. "We thought it was a joke. But it turned out to be the best fighter of the war. We made a terrible mistake underestimating it." Stigler nodded in agreement. "I still hear its engine sometimes," he said. "That deep roar. It's a sound I'll never forget." The P-47 Thunderbolt's journey from flying milk bottle to aerial legend is one of the most remarkable stories of World War II. It began as a mocked outsider, dismissed by friend and foe alike. But through a combination of bold design, tactical innovation, and American industrial might, it became the Luftwaffe's worst nightmare, a plane that could outfight, outlast, and outproduce any enemy fighter. The P-47's legacy lives on today. It is remembered as a symbol of American ingenuity and resilience, a plane that proved that even the most unlikely underdog can rise to greatness. Its success changed the course of aerial combat, reshaped military doctrine, and helped to secure Allied victory in Europe. For the pilots who flew it, the P-47 was more than just a machine, it was a lifeline. As Robert Johnson once said, the P-47 wasn't perfect, but it was ours. It saved our lives, it helped us win the war, and it made us legends. That's all you can ask for in a fighter plane. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt's greatest victory was not the number of enemy planes it shot down, or the ground targets it destroyed. It was the victory of pragmatism over dogma, of mass production over elite craftsmanship, and of a humble, flying milk bottle over the most feared air force in the world. That is a legacy that will never be forgotten. As General George Patton, whose Third Army relied heavily on P-47 close air support, once said, "No army has ever had a better friend than the P-47 Thunderbolt. It is the greatest weapon ever devised for the destruction of the enemy." And for the Luftwaffe, that destruction was total. The flying milk bottle had become the stuff of nightmares, and in doing so, had secured its place in history as one of the greatest fighters of all time.